Hello and welcome everyone to North London Story Festival 2021. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Luisa Villas-Boas and I'll be your host this afternoon, along with our co-host Jody Hammond. If you have any questions for Lara or Sarah, feel free to send them to the chat. Today we're joined by Lara Thompson and Sarah Savitt, the author and editor of the novel One Night, New York, a detective story set in the 1930s. Thank you so much to you both for being with us today. I would like to start by asking you to briefly introduce yourselves. We can start with you, Lara.
Hello, so I'm Lara Thompson, as Louisa said, author of One Night, New York. And I'm also one of the film lecturers on the film program here. I teach primarily screen aesthetics and film theory and ideology. And yeah, I'm a writer, lecturer, yes, multitasker currently.
Hi, and I'm Sarah Savitt, and I'm just going to advertise Lara's book because I've got it here. So this is Lara's
She's
novel.
doing her job already.
Exactly, yeah. So I run Virago, which is a feminist publisher that was founded almost 50 years ago. And in addition to running the publisher and running the team, I also still edit and publish books, including Lara's novel. And I think Lara will probably say a little bit more about this, but I came to publish Lara's novel through a competition. So generally I get books through agents, but occasionally we find writers in different ways. And yeah, in addition to being at Virago, I volunteer for a feminist campaign group called UK Feminista, do a bit of teaching, have a toddler, have a cat. That's about it.
We're all multitasking here.
Not as much as you, but yeah.
There you are.
Brilliant. One Night New York has been very well received, with critics calling it thrilling and evocative. Tell us a little about the story of the novel and how the idea for this book came to be.
Yeah, so as Sarah said, I won a competition with One Night New York, so it's a bit of an unusual path to publication, I guess. So I started writing it. I did a kind of evening class at a place called City Lit in London, which is a really kind of affordable place to go and do evening classes. They run stuff from pottery through to writing workshops and kind of everything in between. And it's a really lovely place. If anyone's interested in doing any night classes or doing anything in their spare time, I can highly recommend it. So a lovely teacher there who was teaching me, and I basically used to go on Fridays because it was the only day that I had off. And it was me and a lot of people who were kind of over 65 and were writing memoirs and were really lovely. But I made some really nice friendships at the same time. And so one day the kind of teacher came in and she gave us a postcard. And the postcard that she gave me was an Edward Hopper painting. And I'd seen some of Edward Hopper's work before, but I hadn't really thought about it in depth. And it was basically a woman sitting in a diner in it's a bit later than my book set, but it is in the 1940s. And so this then kind of became the start of my book. So I started to think about who the woman was. The task in the room on the day was to just write about what this person was doing and kind of imagine a single scene with them in. And I took my person out of that scene that they were in and didn't do the task for the day, which is basically the story of my life. I ignored what the main instruction was and did something else and put her on top of the Empire State Building for some reason. And I'm not 100% sure about why I did that on that day. And then, so I did that and then sort of had good remarks and got a bit told off for not doing what I was supposed to. And then the following day, I was working on a paper, which was something to do for my normal job on photography. And I was researching a woman called Bernice Abbott, who is basically a really famous American photographer, 20th century American photographer, who I hadn't come across, but who seemingly the rest of the world had. So it's just one of those sort of blank bits in my knowledge that I wasn't aware I hadn't known about her. And her photographs were so evocative and beautiful, but also really kind of rigorous in the way that she was photographing changing New York at this time. So it was a period when skyscrapers were being built, but you could also get photographs of kind of clapboard, 8 houses from like the late 1800s in New York as well. So really amazing photographs. And suddenly I imagined this woman who was standing on top of the Empire State Building with Bernice Abbott, and I don't know why. And the key shot that did it for me in this book that I was looking at was a picture called Night Scene New York, which again, I stole the comma from for my title. And yeah, it was basically taken at a very specific time. So it had to be taken on winter solstice, and it had to be taken just as kind of the sun had gone down, so about 5:30-ish. And this kind of specific time frame really intrigued me, because you had to have a certain kind of quality of light in order to capture this kind of 1,000 lit windows seen from the top of the Empire State Building. So I started to think about this, and then read a little bit more about Bernice Abbott, and it turned out that she had to bribe a number of security guards in order to get up at the Empire State Building at this time. The building had just been built, so it's early 1930s. And this really intrigued me, like the gumption of this woman, and the danger that she had been in, because you have to balance quite precariously to get the right shot. And I started to put her together with this other woman, and slowly I started to think about why they might be on top of this building together. Are they just there to take a photograph? Obviously not. What else is going on? And that was really kind of the seed of the whole thing. And I put it to one side for a bit, worked on it a little bit during my night classes that I was going to, and then saw an advert for this prize that Virago was running with the Pool website, that was a great kind of online magazine website that I used to have a look at. And I missed the first call, so I basically had 1 week left to write another, I think, 3,000 words. How many words was it, Sarah? Remind me. What was the total word limit the first
I think it was 5,000 words.
Yeah, so yeah, that makes sense there. So I had about 2,000 words, and I had a week to write another 3,000 words. And in that week, I was also teaching, and yeah, and I was about to go on holiday. So I can remember my husband saying to me, "There's no way, you're never going to get it in on time. Whatever you submit is going to be rubbish. You're going to, and being so positive in that way that your partner often is when you're supposed to be like packing and buying stuff for holidays, and instead you're locked in a shed somewhere." And I was like, no, I think I really got to enter this. And it was funny because I'd never entered a competition before at all with my writing, not a single one. I was too terrified. And so, yeah, I don't quite know why still, but this was the one that I decided to enter. And so I entered it and then forgot about it, and then had a lovely email from Sarah sort of later that year saying, "You've won the prize." And I mean, Sarah can tell you whether this is true or not, but I think they might have thought that there was an entire novel already that existed. And sort of had this conversation where I said, no, well, I might need a bit more time to write the entire thing before it gets published. So then there was like many years in between then and now. So I know it was a bit of a long-winded answer, but it was, so it was like it came in many stages, the evolution of the book, and was kind of hit by many different influences. So yeah, I don't know if that's true. Maybe Sarah can reveal it now, whether they thought that there was a whole book, or whether they knew from the way it was written that there was only a few thousand words.
No, I think, we genuinely didn't know. I mean, we asked for the competition, for the first 5,000 words. And we did also ask for a synopsis. So yes. I guess you gave the impression that you knew, at least where this was going. So, but yeah, I think when you run a competition like that, you don't know whether someone's, has a novel that they've been working on for 10 years, or whether, it's something that they've just started or been working on in bits and starts. So, yeah, we were open to anything.
And you've already hinted at it a bit, but I wanted to ask more, what was that transition from academic writing to writing a novel like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've always written in one form or another, and I think my academic writing's really helped in many ways. So because ever since I did my PhD, I knew that the way to get a big chunk of writing done is to just keep chipping away at it. And so like this kind of myth that I don't know, that it's in like an unachievable huge mountain to climb is not necessarily the case. I don't think, if you break it down into tiny chunks. And this is what I was having a conversation with another student with about earlier today, and sort of they were saying, God, it's such a big assignment. And I was going, look, just break it into stages. And because I knew that, it was a bit less intimidating than it might have been, I think, to take on a kind of whole novel. I'd written another novel that has never seen the light of day and may never see the light of day, that I squirreled away a long time ago, about 10 years ago. So again, I'd already attempted it, and I've always been writing poetry and stuff, but nothing's ever been published before. Partly because I've been super busy in academia doing other things, but also because I just didn't feel very confident at all, which is why I never entered anything into competitions, never told anybody that I was writing very often, and kept it a little bit like my dirty little secret that I went off and did in my shed by myself when I occasionally had free time. So the transition, and I suppose this sort of speaks to the theme of the festival a little bit, that transformation was not as kind of big or jarring as it might seem, I guess. And we were talking before the start a little bit about how filmic some of the passages are in the book, and that is very much informed, obviously, by me lecturing and talking to people like Louisa and my other students about their filmmaking. So yeah, it's the two are kind of intertwined. I guess I found it quite freeing as well, writing a novel. Academic writing can be really constrained, and there are lots of rules, as you're learning now, Louisa. But yeah, there are lots of kind of hoops to jump through. And while kind of creative writing, novel writing has its own hoops, they're not quite as restrained, I don't think. So yeah, I found it quite freeing to make stuff up for a change, and to not have to like cross-check everything in 6 books before I wrote it down, I guess. So yeah, it was a relatively simple transition, but one where moving from one thing to another has been quite helpful, I think.
Related to that visual quality of the book that you mentioned, can you tell us a bit more about the amount of research that you did for it? Because
yeah,
it's written about the 1930s, and writing reflects that as well, I found. So what was the research like? What was that process like?
Yeah, so it's one of my favorite parts of writing a book, I've discovered, is the research. And I went first to that photographer, Bernice Abbott. So she's a massive source of inspiration for this, and a huge body of work. So she takes pictures, as I said, of everything from the New York skyline to people in diners to self-portraits. She traveled extensively, so she's got some beautiful portraits of very famous people in Paris. She photographed James Joyce, amongst others. And so her body of work is my absolute first port of call for all stuff that I was written about in that book. But also, I think it's you sort of can't write about the era without also reading kind of other kind of from the people that were there at the time. So I read quite a lot of first-hand experiences, especially of people who the beginning of the book starts out in the Dust Bowl, so in kind of Central America, the center of America, in that era. And so stories of the Great Depression, I read quite a lot of those first-hand experiences. There's a bit in the book when Francis is recalling being in the middle of a dust storm, and that is almost verbatim from a first-hand account of what it was like to be in the middle of that sort of huge dust storm. So yeah, the book is so reliant on extensive research of the era. And yeah, I love that bit of it. That bit's like the easy bit of all of this, is reading and looking at other stuff. And I miss so much sitting in the British Library with books piled up all around and sort of thinking about all of this and which bit to include and what person looks like they should be in a particular scene. I especially love that. If you go to old newspaper clippings from an era, and you can find kind of just the way people stand or their gestures, you can steal stuff like that, and that's really good. And it's like, I think I've said this before in a lecture at some point, you just steal everything, just nick it, tweak it slightly, and it's fine. So yeah, it's a pleasure doing that bit of the research. And of course, you know, films of the era as well. So Scarface, especially the original Scarface, was a particular influence on a lot of it. A lot of the kind of the stuff when the hoods are driving around in their vehicles. One amazing bit of research, my favorite bit of research, was realizing that there was an entire group of Black GIs in the First World War called the Harlem Hellfighters. And I knew that there were black GIs in the Second World War, but I hadn't known that there was this group in the First World War. So 1914, 15, 16. And so that was really exciting because I found some great photos of them, and and they kind of amalgamated into one of my key characters, this kind of ex-serviceman who'd served in that regiment. And they were also jazz players, so lots of the people in that regiment then went off and were kind of performing in some of the jazz clubs in the 1930s. So that to me was wonderful, the idea that there were these men standing there who'd been to war in France, some of whom had won Purple Hearts and then had come back and they're now performing, playing saxophone behind Billie Holiday, who was performing in front of Mae West at the same time as the mayor of New York was there and a load of drug addicts. I was just like, God, this is so good. So yeah, the research, books are nothing. Books about, this period are nothing without research. I think you can't make it all up.
Brilliant. We have a question here from Amanda Symbol asking, you mentioned photographs as your inspiration for the novel. Do you have any other things that inspire your writing?
God, yeah, paintings especially. The book's full of different kinds of paintings. So I mentioned Edward Hopper at the start, but then Frances herself goes to see an exhibition at one of the big galleries in New York at the time, and it's the summer exhibition. And famously at the summer exhibition that year was a painting by Pierre Bonnard. And Bonnard, I've always loved Bonnard. And Bonnard I decided to include his paintings in the book itself because I was trying to imagine a kind of painting that if a woman like Frances, who had come from Kansas in the early 1930s and traveled to New York, like what would she be astounded by? What would have moved her? And it's so it couldn't be anything too angular and modernist because I think she just wouldn't have got that. But with something like Bonnard, you don't need to have any kind of prior knowledge of art or what the point in any of it is. And this particular painting, I felt like really looked like Bonnard had been thinking about nature at the same time. And nature and the outdoors is something that Frances is kind of missing while she's in New York. So while it's a kind of picture of a woman in a bathroom, it's also so much more than that, and it's multi-layered. And so, yeah, painting's huge influence in the way that I write, as well as film photography. Whereas I was saying that I read lots around an area, I'm also strapped for time. So I also find image-based stuff can be so much quicker and easier, and I'm always more struck by that. So while I read first-person accounts a lot, I rely on visual material far more, I think. So yeah, anything visual from an area, just go to that straight away if you're thinking of writing something set in a particular period. Yeah, go and cover your walls in it. I'm not in my shed at the moment, annoyingly, because we've moved house since I had my shed, but I literally plastered the walls of my shed with certain images that I printed out, much to the chagrin again of the other people in my house who kept complaining that I was using up all the printer ink. So yeah, that's the way that I do it. Cover yourself and your life in the era, and it will sort of come through in the writing somehow, I guess, hopefully.
Brilliant. We have a question here from David Cottis, who asks, you talked about... Hi, David. You talked about the visual qualities of the novel. Do you think it would make a good film? And if so, who would be the ideal director or actors?
Oh, that's such a good question from DC. Yeah, of course, I mean, please someone step forward and turn it into a film for me. That would be the best thing that's ever happened. So, if next time when if we're running the film course, we can try and get the students to turn it into a film somehow. That would be nice. But yeah, who would play the characters? God. I guess I would like someone quite unusual, someone you wouldn't think to direct it. Probably someone like Lynn Ramsey. So somebody that can bring a sort of an element of realism, but also a touch of magic realism, a touch of kind of quirky and interesting use of color. We know, it's crying out for Todd Haynes to do it as well. I know this will please Louisa greatly, but, Carol was something that was sort of in the back of my head all the time. It's really hard to not write something that's period with two female main characters who may or may not have a romance without thinking about Carol, I think. But in terms of the main characters, God, I don't know. I don't know. You're going to have to come back to me. I don't know who would play the main characters at the moment. If anyone's got any suggestions, I'm up for that. But I think on it, David. You would think that I'd thought about this question before, but I haven't.
I have to say, in the train, when we see this lady who's smoking a cigarette, I immediately imagine Kate Blanchett. My brain immediately went there.
Yeah, exactly. You can't not, right? And yeah, so Jax, maybe Blanchett. Blanchett's a bit too pale for Jax, I think. This woman who is, she's like really dark and brooding. I don't know who's got it. I'll have to think about it. Sorry, David, it's a bit of a rubbish answer.
We have a question here from James Graham, who says, really interesting to hear about the impact of your research on the characters. Did you come across anything late into the writing and have to go back and change characters or aspects of the narrative?
Oh yeah, loads. Does James mean because I realized that it wasn't true, or because I felt like it didn't work? I guess that would be my question. But yeah, I changed loads. I mean, Sarah changed loads. How many versions of this book did I write, Sarah? Sarah can come in here and tell you about how the impact of the editing process, because I think there's this idea that as novelists, you sort of sit around by yourself and then churn out this perfect book. At least that's sort of what I thought before I did it as well. You know, this lonely writer in their shed banging away writing. But that's not how it is. I mean, that's how it is for a chunk of time, but then it gets handed over to Sarah and to Rose at Virago, who then read it and kind of go, this bit's really good. This bit, you need to cut out this entire chunk because it's not quite working. And they're really nice because they don't say you have to do it. It's not quite like a lecturer-student situation where I sit down with you guys and go, get rid of all this, and I'm a bit harsh. They go, we recommend, like, this is a nice suggestion. And then you sort of wrestle with yourself for a while because, you know, nothing that you write is written lightly. It's taken a bloody long time. And, you know, you start to think about how many thousands of words it is and how many days of work that was. And it's painful. But in the end, they are almost always right. So that was my big learning curve, was going from a point of thinking, you know, the writer is the kind of master of their work, to a situation where it's a collaboration. And that's what's so interesting. And I guess this again speaks to kind of the theme of the festival a bit, is this idea of transformation. How is Sarah coming in and transforming that kind of raw material into something that can be published? So I'm sure Sarah might say stuff about this now, and not just how, you know, it works with my book, but also how it works generally.
Yeah, it's interesting about the difference between author, editor, and like lecturer, student, because my partner is an academic, so I hear now, because of being at home, I hear him talking to his students about their work, and he hears me talking to writers, and I mean, there is, you know, there's differences in that, you know, if you're a student, you know, your essay's due on this day and you've got to get it done, and, you know, you're getting marked and all this kind of stuff. So I guess it's a bit more like, I don't know, he's more of a cut to the chase person. So yeah, a little bit more unvarnished, I guess. I think with editing, I mean, definitely the writer does all the work, and it's, you know, it's like, my name isn't on the cover of this book. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's, you know, so, you know, when Lara gets reviews, you know, whether that's by, you know, in the Times, she got a very nice review in the Times, or on Goodreads or Amazon, you know, they're not thinking about me. It's her who's getting, you know, either getting the praise or the blame. So, and I think as the editor, you always have to be aware of that. It's the author's book in the end of the day, and but you're trying to get the best version of the book, and to figure out, you know, I mean, you can come to it sort of with some like objectivity and sort of saying, well, the beginning's a bit boring, or, you know, sort of like this bit, I didn't understand why the character did this on page 50 or whatever. But you're also trying to talk to the writer about, what are they trying to do? Like, what's the vision for the book in their head, and how to get that down on the page. And I think Lara's right that it involves in the end a lot of people. So I mean, this is partly because I went on maternity leave in the middle, but I think I did notes. My colleague Donna, who just loved the book and, you know, sort of contributed some notes. And I remember Donna pointing out something about there was, and sorry, Lara, forgive me, I now actually can't even remember which character this was about, but there was a sister, and Donna pointed out something about the sister.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The relationship between these two sisters, and Lara and I were like, because Lara and I are both only children, so we were like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, this is good to have someone with a sibling point this out.
That was so fascinating, that bit, because it was something to do with the relationship between Agnes and her sister.
That's right.
And I can't remember which way around I originally had it, whether the sister was older or younger than her. And Donna just went, that is not how a sister would relate that bit of information. If she was the older one, she needs to be younger. And I was like, oh, okay. And I remember us having conversations, like you say, we're only children. So there are some things that there are just gaps in your knowledge that you may, you know, that's not something I think to research, sibling relationships. I think I could just sort of get the gist of that. So yeah, there's stuff that people catch, and yeah, you're just so grateful for them correcting things. So sort of a roundabout way of answering James's question, I know, but yeah, there was loads of stuff that went in and then came out again. Yeah, there was towards the end of the book, there's a big kind of dramatic scene, and I'm not going to say too much because I know lots of people haven't read it all the way through yet, but it's basically there's a terrible murder is about to take place, and the way that I had written it was even more horrific than it has ended up in the book, and I had sort of pushed the book into the realm of, I don't know, serial killers, and kind of, it was really extreme and intense. And I remember Sarah and Rose, who was also editor on it, coming back and sort of saying, it's a bit, you've taken it a bit far. And that was something that I really wrestled with, was because my instinct is always, if someone tells you you've done something and it's a bit much, I sort of mentally push back on that a bit and go, you know, when is it too much? You know, too much for who? Polite society? Too much for what? You know, and so I spent a day having a debate with myself about that one, whether to rein it in a little bit. And in the end, I did rein it in a little bit, and I'm really glad I did, because it's much more subtle and nuanced now than the way that I had originally sort of conceived of it. But again, a book isn't, I think the important thing to think is that a book isn't this thing that just gets written in one sitting and then it's done. It is a huge series of stepping stones sort of reaching out in front of you. And sometimes you walk on all of them at once, and sometimes you slip and fall in the water a bit and you have to get back on again. And, you know, it's like a constant continued forward motion where you're going back, going forward, going back. And so it's, yeah, it's a constant process of revision. And all that writing is rewriting stuff that I probably said to you guys 1,000 times in class when you're working on your assignments. It doesn't just come out perfect. It comes out in a massive, you know, crappy pile of rubbish, and then you shape it and shape it and shape it. And one of the people that's shaping it is Sarah and Rose, who was really helping me while Sarah was on maternity leave. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting dynamic as well, because I was really lucky, you know, to get two great editors rather than one. And Rose and Sarah are both very different in the way that they edited the book. And so that was a fascinating process as well, because Sarah, as you can tell, is this quite calm, relaxed, sort of softly spoken, sensitive person. And Rose is not as calm. And is quite blunt and brutal and wonderful with it, and again almost always right. So it was really brilliant to have inputs from both people, and I think the book really kind of improved and kind of really was better as a result of having all that input.
About the themes of the book, was there a specific trope or idea that you gave your own twist to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, for a while, until I you know, until we really started to think about the fact that I'd won an award for a crime, to be the new crime writer, I didn't really think I was writing crime fiction. I thought I was writing something that happened to have something where people think about murdering someone. So I guess in terms of genre, I realized through the process of doing that, I was putting a kind of different spin on the trope of that kind of crime novel, I guess. But in terms of themes, I was really interested in, and we mentioned this briefly before, in the idea of having a kind of LGBTQ plus will they, won't they romance, especially set in this era, because you didn't see that much, and you didn't see it in this genre that much. That's the sort of genre in and of itself over there. So I wanted to normalize that in this era a little bit as well. And again, part of the research was the fact that Bernice Abbott was gay, but if you had said to her, you're gay, she would have gone absolutely mental and ballistic at you, and she did. There's like a passage that I read about a journalist saying that she was a lesbian photographer, and she totally kicked off, rightly so, about that, and said, I'm a photographer, and that was it, full stop. And so I loved that. So a lot of that came from her, I guess, and from things that I read about her. She ended up being a brilliant ping pong player as well, as an aside. So her whole life is just one big, like, joyous event. So I can't encourage you enough to go out and have a look at Bernice Abbott. She's just brilliant in every way. So yeah. And so I guess I was trying to mess around with all those kinds of tropes. And obviously, I teach a lot in the third year, as some of you know, about feminist film theory. That came into it a lot as well. I wanted to write something where women felt empowered, but that it wasn't in this real hit you over the head way. It was in a way where they were sort of finding that strength themselves along the way. And so, yeah, there's a whole mashup of stuff in there. I wanted to write about the jazz era and play with that a little bit. I wanted to think again about what it is to be a Black ex-serviceman in America at this time. Because on the one hand, well, these people were kind of applauded sometimes out in the field of battle. And like I said, these guys were winning Purple Hearts and things. When they came back to their home, they occasionally were given like low-level parades, and then they were completely forgotten about and sort of thrown away. So the way that these men had been received in France as fighters was really different to the way that they received at home. So I was interested in approaching a number of different themes, I guess, from different angles, and sort of revealing bits of history that I guess I hadn't read about much. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but I just hadn't encountered it that much in this context. So yeah, let's chucking in a load of stuff, I guess.
We have a question here to Sarah Savitt from James Graham again, who asks, I'd be really interested to learn if the editorial relationship was in any way different with Lara as opposed to an author who comes through the agent route.
That's a good question.
Yeah, good question. Thanks for asking. It was, yes, it was different in that, so Lara now has not one but two literary agents. But while we were working on the book, while we were doing the editorial process, she didn't have an agent. And I'd say every relationship's different, but some writers are really, really close to their agent and would never show anything to their editor before their agent had written it. For other people, their agent, is kind of their like business manager, and does their deals and sort of advises in their career, but doesn't really read the manuscript. But definitely, having done it through the competition, Lara and I worked together on earlier kind of like more raw material. Whereas if something gets through to me from an agent, generally that person has done, even if the agent's more of a deal maker, you would generally do like at least one draft, maybe even, 2 or 3. I mean, some agents work with clients for a couple of years before they send stuff out. So I guess I was seeing things in a kind of slightly earlier state. And also it's very unusual with fiction to take something on from a debut writer that's not finished. So, if Margaret Atwood wants to, sort of just tell us in a paragraph what she's going to write, then we're fine to take that book on. But if you're a first-time novelist, generally we wouldn't take on a book before it's been written. Obviously, that's different with the competition. So, and sorry, Lara, I now can't remember sort of how much we talked kind of along the way, or if I read sort of chunks of it or anything. But yeah, I was there. It felt like I was there much more from the start than I would be with something that came through an agent. Although I do still do a lot of editorial work with books from agents, but it's, you're just getting it at a different stage.
Yeah, I can't quite remember exactly how much I sent, but I think I sent it in kind of thirds or quarters or something like that. I remember it giving you chunks at a time. Um, and yeah, it was different for me as well, I think. And I only realize that now that I've got the agents, in that I was relying on Sarah and Rose for a lot more than just like editing help. I was relying on them to sort of answer all my questions about the publishing world as well. And loads of those I would now just ask my agents about. So yeah, it was quite different for both of us, I think, although I didn't realize that at the time. I was just sort of leaning on them both, going, and yeah, it was a slightly different thing because your agent as well stands between you and the kind of, if there's any wranglings to be had about rights issues or stuff like that, and you go to your agent before you go to your editor. And again, I was clueless as to all of that, and until very recently. I still am clueless to some of it, in all honesty, but yeah, it does become clear along the way.
We have a question here from Helen that relates to another one that was asked earlier, and one that I want to ask myself. Sorry, I lost the question. Okay. Can you tell us a bit about the process of building the characters and how you made decisions about who they are? I know you started with a character. You started the story with a character, and then you wrote about the world around him. And I was also wondering how that affected the world building, because you worked from the within, from the character to the outside.
Yeah, it was with my main character. I didn't work on her like consciously that much. I felt like I knew who Frances was as soon as I knew that she was someone who had traveled from Kansas to New York this period. I felt like I could visualize so many bits of it already, so it felt quite unconscious, the building of her. With Agnes, I was trying to combine a lot of different things. So on the one hand, she's a little bit Bernice Abbott, but she's also a number of other female photographers in the mix as well. So Margaret Bourke-White, and if you Google Margaret Bourke-White, you get these amazing pictures of her sitting on top of the Chrysler building with her camera. And she's someone who, like Lee Miller, went into war zones in the 40s. And Miller was someone who, you know, she was one of the first people into some of the concentration camps in the Second World War. So I built Agnes is sort of an embryonic version of lots of these different female photographers. So stealing, I guess, is my main tip, again, in terms of building characters. The character of Jax was built from a single image that Bernice Abbott had taken of a woman called Juna Barnes, who's quite a famous woman from this era, who's like a socialite. She gave a lot of her money away to kind of struggling artists and to photographers. And one of the reasons Bernice Abbott was taking her photo was because she had paid her quite a lot of money to do it. So she's sort of helping people out a lot. She has this, in this photo, she has this amazing gold turban on and a pair of slacks and red lipstick. So visually, I was stealing a lot from the photographs. But in terms of their personalities, again, that was somewhat led by what I was trying to, the end point that I wanted to get to with it, I guess. Frances had to meet a number of people in order to become the woman she eventually is. So some of it was led from the character and some of it was led from what I wanted to do with the plot, I guess. And like I said about Ben, the guy that's like an amalgamation of some of the Harlem Hellfighters, those GIs from the First World War, he was someone who I wanted to shed some myths about in terms of this era. And weirdly, one of his main personality traits is something that most writers would find quite boring, in that he's just kind. And I felt like kindness was something that was lacking in the descriptions of men from this era. All the stuff that I've read, they're like brooding. They're much more like Stan, I guess, in the book, Frances's brother. They're kind of troubled and brooding and depressed and all of these other quite negative traits, or violent often. And so I guess I wanted to do something different with Ben and sort of show someone who has been brutalized but has sort of come out the other end with some kindness. So yeah, I'm trying to upend stereotypes whenever I can, I guess, which is, again, something that I think I've said to you guys in class. Not least because otherwise it's boring, but also because we have a duty as writers to kind of, you know, represent as well as we're writing, I guess, to kind of give and offer people a variety of characters doing a wide variety of things. Otherwise, what's the point?
And without giving too much away, what would you say was the hardest scene to write and why?
Oh, well, this is not, oh God, it's going to be hard to not give stuff away. The ending, deciding where the initial premise of the book. So the premise of the book is there's two women on top of the Empire State Building. They're waiting to kill a man. Are they going to kill him or not? So that's like the forward trajectory of the whole thing. And deciding whether they were going to kill him or not was something that I did not know until I had written about 3/4 of it. And it had gone through a number of different versions. So that for me was the hardest decision to make. And again, in conversations in class, we're always saying, think about how you're leaving your audience. What are the messages around that, in terms of if you've told your kind of audience to care about certain characters, or that your characters are emblematic of certain ideas, perhaps how you leave them at the end is really key. So this was like building up in my head. It was there, it was lingering, all this advice that I'd given to all the students over the years. And so that for me was the most difficult thing to kind of agree with myself on. Will they push him or not? So I can't tell you, obviously, but for those of you that have read the book, where I fall on that kind of decision. But yeah, and it was key. It was like, are they brave enough? But is it brave to kill someone? Is it actually really weak to kill someone? So that whole question was the trickiest bit. In a smaller way, there were other tricky points as well, where there's often a struggle in this sort of period book between keeping it as close to the truth, or the kind of accepted truth, and versus getting your characters to be interesting and intriguing. And there were often points where I was battling between what I knew to be true for the era, or to be kind of historical fact, versus what's more interesting for my character to do at this point, or what would they as a real human being do. And that was a kind of battle that I had in almost every scene or every sequence. So yeah, that was a constant flow of, should I do this or not? And again, I think that's where the editor helps out as well. Sometimes I was pushing it too far to the realms of fantasy. And sometimes it was necessary to stop it being sort of staid and boring and what you'd expect people to do, I guess.
And as a contrast, this question goes to both of you. What would you say was your favorite scene in the book, and why?
Oh, I'm going to let Sarah answer that first.
Good question. I mean, I think I was thinking about this actually before we started, not knowing you'd ask that, but I mean, I still feel very, I guess, because the first 5,000 words that I read were, I mean, not exactly what were printed in the book. Obviously, they've changed, but I still do feel very attached to those opening pages, because that's, I mean, obviously that's always the first bit of the book that you read, but I guess because I only had that section to read for quite a long time, it was the sort of yeah, the sort of
emphasis on the long.
Yeah, exactly. And also because, I mean, again, sort of like it's kind of ended up on the cover and
I love
down on the back cover. So it's not, yeah, I don't know if it's my favorite scene, but it's sort of, yeah, I still feel very attached to it. And I remember I just still remember very clearly reading the description of the lights, of the New York lights in that scene, and just thinking, okay, this person is a writer and like she can do it. And so yeah, and I think I don't know, I usually have that sense with every book that I end up working on or want to work on, the point where you're like, okay, yes, I think this is really good, and like it's something I connect with. So, and for me it was yeah, it was quite an early metaphor about the light, sorry, which I'll try to find out, but and now I'm not gonna be able to find it anyway, but so yeah, I think I just have to go with that, just because, as I say, I just feel very attached to it. But I guess I also I couldn't wait to find out, how Lara was going to end it, because yeah, you don't know. But I guess the other thing I'd pick out is, again, like from quite early on, but and I can't remember now if this was in the submission or not, but when you go back to that Dust Bowl scene, I also just thought, oh wow, she can also do this. Like she, you know, it wasn't just like a lucky dip that she can like write about New York in the 30s, but I just thought, okay, she's like creating all these different worlds, and we're suddenly meeting her brother and the parents, and sort of finding out why she's run away. And so I think that, you know, although the rest of the book, pretty much the rest of the book is set in New York, I think that also really sticks in my mind as well. Okay, I'm going to stop and let Lara talk now.
No, that's, I mean, I could just sit and listen to Sarah tell me how good it is all day. This is very relaxing at the end of a hard day. My favorite scene. So I guess there's two that I like that I felt just came out. And I think that sort of affects whether I like the scene in the end or not. So the first one is towards the very end of the book, and there's a scene where that something happens to do with concrete, and I can't really tell you too much because again it's like a huge spoiler, but I'm really proud of that scene in particular, and I did a lot of research around that scene. So towards the end, stuff happens with concrete that probably shouldn't. And yeah, I like that one. And then one that I can also talk about a bit more in a bit more detail is towards the beginning where they go to the Automat. So the Automat is one of these kind of cheap cafes that used to be all over New York. So you'd go in and you'd put a nickel in a slot and you'd get a piece of pie or a hot cup of coffee from a little window. And I really enjoyed writing that whole scene. It's quite a kind of, it starts out being quite an everyday scene and ends up in kind of high drama. And yeah, that whole sequence was really easy to write in it. And I sort of could visualize the whole thing from start to finish without much effort, which is quite unusual for me at least. And so, yeah, I loved writing that scene. And it's the point at which Frances first realizes that New York might not be what she thought it was as well. So it sort of starts out promising so much, and she's so excited about New York still at this point. And by the end of this one scene, this one kind of incident, she starts to get a glimmer of the fact that things are not as great as she hoped. So yeah, it's good, that scene, I think.
I found the metaphor. Can I embarrass you by reading it out?
Yeah, I'll try not to blush. It's a bit weird.
Okay, so it's on page 2. Okay, the dimming sky looked as though it had been stripped from the heavens and iron flat. 1,000 lit windows scattered like sequins on the dress of the night. I really love that metaphor. So very good.
It's funny, that one, because I wrote that about 6 years ago. That one line is actually like pulled from a moment when I was standing in a kitchen writing my PhD in North London when I was much younger, and was looking out at London and wrote that one line down completely randomly, and then found it in a notebook that when I started writing this, and I was like, this matches exactly that photo that Abbott took. And yeah, I adjusted it a little bit, but
God, that's so interesting.
It's
yeah,
weird.
I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like, normally I'm not like, I don't know, in the opening pages, you know, like metaphor is fine, but it was the metaphor, but also in combination with the fact that there was something really exciting happening. So that's what did it for me.
Yeah, I have to strip. That's one of the things, by the way, that I work on the most when I'm in the edit, is that I am quite a floral, like, person who likes a bit of metaphor, and sometimes it's way too much. And so my first drafts are often full of quite flowery language, and I spend a lot of time going back and stripping it all back and taking it out. So that's a tip for any writers out there: is yeah, don't leave all your metaphors in. Take most of them out. Use them sparingly. Otherwise it's a bit too much.
We're almost reaching the end, and because books are such special little things that have the power to change us, I was wondering, did this book change your outlook in life in any way?
Wow. The writing of it changed me. I guess I realized that that I still think that my characters exist in reality. So I guess I still occasionally sit around thinking about Frances and worrying about her, and I didn't expect that to happen. it's changed the way that I feel about, well, it's changed the way I feel about this period of the past. It's changed the way I feel about the First World War and the Second World War. It's changed the way that I felt about women at this time. It changed a lot of things, but I guess that was more to do with my lack of knowledge about this era at the start and what I learned along the way of writing it. And that was an unexpected bonus of writing the book, was that I realized that I wasn't just doing this research to write the story, to write the characters. I was doing it to learn for myself. And so, yeah, I guess that for me is the big shift. The big change is how joyous it is and joyful to learn about an era you've never been in. And that's the kind of pleasure of writing, I guess.
What about you, Sarah?
Such a good question. I think that this is actually the first book that sorry, this is a more pedestrian answer, but this is the first book that I've taken on from a competition like this. And I was really nervous when we ran it, because I thought, this is like a great partnership. And when the pool existed, it was really great. And it was run by someone who also wrote really interesting crime. But I was pretty nervous. I just thought, can you really tell like what, if something's going to be good from 5,000 words in a synopsis? So yeah, I guess, I mean, maybe it was just beginner's luck, but yeah, I guess it has made me think more that you can tell a lot from 5,000 words actually. So I think maybe it's an encouragement to sort of trust my gut quite a bit as an editor. And yeah, that's a much more pedestrian answer, sorry.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you. And as a final question, do you see yourself writing more novels in the near future, perhaps a sequel to One Night in New York? And if so, can you share a tiny bit of your plans for this next book?
Yeah, well, I've started on another one. It's not a sequel, not yet anyway, but I have vaguely considered putting Frances into the Second World War somehow. But I'm not sure how that would roll, or whether I'm going to actually do anything about that or not. It was something a friend said to me, and she thinks she's leaving New York for all these, she's leaving New York, this terrible place, and actually she sails at the end towards France, and that's where actually all the horrors are about to begin. And as she said that, I was like, oh God, yeah, and suddenly had visions of her helping the resistance or something. But the book that I'm actually working on is completely different. It is another crime thriller sort of, but it's set in mid-90s Cornwall, and it's currently going to be called A is for Black, and it's all about this kind of school on a hill called above the sea called the Republic. And yeah, the book starts with two bodies bound together washing up on a beach, and they're discovered by this surfer. And one of the bodies is one of the kids, teenagers from this place, the Republic, and one of them is a local kid. So the book then unravels as to, who are these bodies, why are they there, and what the heck's going on in this strange private school on the cliffs. So yeah, it's sort of half Daphne du Maurier, half Ishiguro is what I'm going for in my head at the moment. Keep your aims low, that's what I say.
Absolutely brilliant. I encourage everyone to go read Lara's book. It is absolutely amazing. Just read the first page and you'll be hooked. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If nobody has any other questions, no. Right. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lara. And have a good evening.